This is a tutorial on the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, Disclosure, and Addendum, CAR Form FHDS. This is a newer form. It's a seller disclosure when a property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. The natural question usually arises, well, how do I know? The easiest way to determine whether or not the property is in a fire hazard zone is to look at the NHD. I have a sample NHD here from fastnhd.com. There are two areas, and this is a state mandated format. So on any NHD company, you will see this, that there'll be two areas, wildland fire hazard area and just a normal fire hazard severity zone. If this is checked, if any of these fire risk areas are checked, you are required, or the seller is required, to do this form. And you don't have to rely exclusively on the NHD. You could look up Cal OES, and there's a fire hazard map. I mean, if you do a little digging online, you can find different state maps where you can enter an address and see if you're in a high fire hazard zone. But if the property is in a fire hazard zone, then this form is required. So we'll jump right into it. Now, there is a lot of text, and at first skim, it looks like a bit much and a little confusing, but it's actually not that bad. So we'll get through it quickly. We start by putting the date of the purchase agreement. Like most forms, it references a purchase agreement, the date of it. We have an address and the name of the parties. Then it's going to describe what this form's about and the requirement. It mentions high or very high fire hazard severity zones. It's all boilerplate text. We can just scroll right through it all the way down to section 2. That's the first place that you may need to do something. Now, by default, if you don't do anything, we're saying this home is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. The reason that it's default is because, in theory, you're only doing this form if it is in a high fire risk zone. So if the NHD shows it, you're doing this form. If not, why would you do this form? And there's actually a second area. This home is not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, with a checkbox to do something different than the default. Well, it seems a little silly, but I imagine that there are brokerages that have a checklist that require this form to be done on every transaction. And so if you're delivering this to the buyer and the home's not in a high fire hazard severity zone, then you check this box probably to not freak the buyer out and just say, look, I'm giving this disclosure so you know about fire risk, but this this does not pertain to this particular property. So you check that box. We don't even require this form unless it's in a high fire hazard zone. But the brokerages that do, you would check this box. So you can just skip right on down to this next area. There's even a website they put here, which is helpful, readyforwildfire.org, if you want to look up hazard zones. There are other ones I'm familiar with too, so anyone will do. But moving on, it asks here, now this is a question for the seller. Is the seller aware of any of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers? Now, your seller might look at this and say, well, I don't know. Well, if you don't know, then don't check any, because it's asking, are you aware? So if the seller's aware, the seller checks a box. If they're not aware, they don't check the box. And by not checking a box, it doesn't mean that they're saying, no, it doesn't exist. They're saying, I'm not aware of it. That's it. You can only disclose what you know of, what you're aware of. So if the seller looks through here and is aware of something, check the box. If not, move right on. There's not much thought to put into it. You're either aware of something or you're not. The next section that something needs to be done is down here in 4B2. Actually, let's say 4B in general. So it asks, and there's a default here. 4B1 is a default where, in theory, you don't have to do anything on this form, because if the seller's unaware, they don't have to check any boxes. And if none of these, if 4B, 2 or 3, or 2, 3, and 4 don't apply, no one has to check boxes, because there's a default. 4B1 is the default. And we'll read what the default says. If nothing's done in section 4, it says that there's no local ordinance, meaning that there's no county or city ordinance requiring that the seller have some sort of inspection on their property. Some places do, and as the listing agent, you should know, because it just takes a matter of a couple minutes to look up if there's a city or county ordinance for a fire inspection or an annual certification or something like that. It's very easy to find out, but many places don't have an ordinance. So by default, it says no local ordinance, and then it puts on the buyer. Buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with the state. And I think this just is basically saying the seller is not obligated because there's no local ordinance. It's on you. The onus is on the buyer to figure this out. So it's, the home's being sold to you, you're the buyer, you have to deal with any sort of compliance going forward. And that's it. You don't even have to check a box. That's the default. Now, here are some exceptions to the default. Let's say there's no local ordinance, and the seller has, in the last 6 months, obtained documentation of compliance, meaning that they have some sort of document from whomever that they have for whatever reason showing that their home is in compliance with having defensible space. Well, if they have it, check the box and make sure the buyer has a copy of the document. Pretty simple. The seller should give the buyer any and all documents like that in the disclosure period. It should be like a full-on data dump of everything that the seller knows given to the buyer, so the buyer can do their proper investigation and not go after the seller for withholding information. All right. Or 3, local vegetation management or other defensible space ordinance in effect. If there is an ordinance in effect, then, and so I should mention there are 2 different cases when we come across a local ordinance, because in B you have the top 2 where there's no local ordinance, and it's basically saying no local ordinance, buyer needs to worry about it in the future, or no local ordinance, but by chance seller has documentation that they're going to give the buyer. All right. Now, what happens if there is a local ordinance? Well, there are 2 situations. There is a point of sale and non-point of sale requirement. So now, this can be easily determined once you know about the local ordinance, because the local ordinance will explicitly mention whether or not it's a point of sale requirement. So it's saying, is a seller required to certify that they're in compliance before they sell a home? If the answer is yes, you'll check the box down here that the seller shall provide documentation. Or is there a local ordinance, but the seller is not required to certify the property to sell? You check this box, number 3, because it's on the buyer. And this basically just determines who's obligated. And 3 is saying there is a local ordinance, but it's the buyer who needs to address compliance going forward. And down here on 4 is saying, well, there's a local ordinance, but it's the seller that should provide documentation that shows they're in compliance because it's required that the seller do it. And again, the local ordinance is going to tell you which party is required. Now, if there's no local ordinance, you can just leave. You don't have to worry about anything below. You can just leave it with the default text and move right on. This was a lengthy explanation, but in essence, the majority of people, nothing's going to be checked on here. This form will be done without nothing being checked. And for some people, the seller is going to check something here. And that's really the seller that's going to check boxes of whatever they're aware of when they do the disclosures. And then, of course, if something was checked down here, you're going to reference the report or inspection or whatever certified the compliance. And the seller is going to sign, the buyer is going to acknowledge, everyone moves on. So the form's not that wild. Now, if you have questions about it, hopefully my explanation wasn't too lengthy, but I just kind of wanted to address all the different variables that can affect how this form would be completed. Go ahead and leave a comment and I'll promptly answer. And I appreciate you watching. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you.